Thank you so much, Julie. Hi, everybody. I'm Cullen. I'm the pastor here at Northern Light, and we are on a mission to invite ordinary people to feel and to show the extraordinary love of Jesus. And I hope you've experienced a little bit of that here today. We do all kinds of different things to communicate that and to share that. One of the ways that we did that is by including other people in sharing a message. Last week, Patrick did that. He did an awesome job. Super thankful that we have a community where there's people who can just jump up and speak from their hearts and their background and knowledge, and that was really, really fantastic. Another thing I want to let you know about is next week, Jenny and I are going to be leading music together, kind of giving the band Labor Day weekend if they can't be around. But we have a great time doing music together, so hope you can come and join us for that. Also, next week, we are doing something, it's been a couple years since we've done it, Q&A Sunday. So bring your questions next week, and I'll get through as many of them as I can, sharing my opinion, but we can also do things in a more conversational style too. Like if you want to say, yeah, but what about this, then I can talk about that. But we just don't want to get hung up on one question forever. Anyway, we'll explain it all next week. It's going to be a good time. You can ask your questions anonymously on a piece of paper if you feel embarrassed. Like, why don't I already know this? Like, some of your questions are going to be like super linear. Like, what is the answer to this simple question? And I can tell you, or maybe I can't. I don't know. There's lots of stuff I don't know. But then there are other things where we can out a bunch of the different possibilities and think through things together as a community. Something that's been a key to our kind of growing forward and what kind of church we're becoming is to realize we aren't going to agree on everything, and that's okay. We don't have to have all the right beliefs all lined up perfectly to be family here. Being family doesn't mean you get along all the time or that you agree on everything. I mean, those of you with families know that, right? Being family means loving in the right way and committing to one another. And so that's what we do here. We're going to hash some things out, do some family business next week, and talk about some of the questions that are on our hearts. And I hope you're able to make it for that. It should be really good. And that's all I got for my lead-in stuff. So I'd like to invite our scripture reader forward. Thanks, Jamie.
The scripture today comes from Romans 12:3-13. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. And if it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor, serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality.
Well, this morning is the fourth and final part in a series that we're doing on consumerism and the lies that we sell ourselves. So consumerism, I'll talk a little bit more about that, but it is the water that we swim in this culture, about buying and selling and how much we get our identity out of that. And so we've been talking about how we can pull ourselves out of the muck and see the world as it really is, the beauty and the inherent value in all people, and how we can kind of rise above all of that, float to the surface. And today, we're going to be talking about competition and comparison. And they're really two sides of the same coin. They're both ways that we assert our value over and against one another. So, of course, one of the clearest ways to see competition in action in our culture is through sports, Football season's around the corner, and people are wearing their purple or other colors that we shall not mention all the time. We brag about how our team is better than your team, and when our team happens to lose to your team, well, we got jobbed by the officials, or, that team just spends all that money, or it's because of the one fluke play, right? Because we can't possibly believe that maybe the other team was better, right? That's not happening. Or it's also election season. Perhaps you've seen the beautiful signs beginning to litter your neighbor's lawns. I live on a busy street, so that means every year we get hit hard. And so, the camps are already starting to form. There's there's the red and blue signs, and then there's the blue and lighter blue signs, and then those are just kind of back and forth popping up all down our road. It's exciting. But competition and comparison go way beyond that, too. I don't know if you've seen the vehicle that I drive. You don't have to laugh. I mean, it's okay. Well, it isn't pretty. It's a blue minivan that is, oh, there she is. It's rusting through in many places. Some friends and I tried to patch over some of the rust. Actually, those friends are here today. All right. Good to see you. Tried to patch over the rust with some Bondo and then some paint that mostly matched. And then the rust just came back with a vengeance anyway and just poked through and said, "Did you miss me?" Also, so I have this van. Also, I live in Andover. And so every time I pick the kids up from school or just go to Target, then I'm going to be parked next to an Escalade, for sure. Or some shiny new something or other, brand new giant SUV. And so I often find myself playing that comparison game in my own head. I wonder if people think less of me because of the car that I'm driving, because of my beloved rust bucket. And so to compensate for that, then I find ways to compare myself to others in ways that help me puff up a little bit, I was driving to work this week and found myself behind almost the exact minivan as mine, except it looked like this. Ha-ha! Victory! And if you can't tell, yes, that rear window is blown out. Pretty great. Shards of glass dangling around. And I thought about my ride and said to myself, hey, I ain't doing too bad. I was also walking through a parking lot this week, and I saw this shiny new Mercedes convertible. And I was about to start salivating until I saw the whiskey plates. And all my friends in the recovery community, can I get a witness? Yeah, they would comfortably say that you wouldn't trade that Mercedes for your sobriety, would you? No way. Our need to compare ourselves to one another in our culture today is largely driven by our consumerism. In case you missed it, consumerism is a social and economic order that encourages the acquisition of goods and services in ever-increasing amounts. So that's the whole idea. There always has to be more. Or in the words of Dr. Seuss, we have to keep biggering and biggering and biggering, right? And if our amount of possessions has to keep increasing to be part of the system that we all live in, that means the one with more is winning. The one with newer, bigger, upgraded toys wins. And also, the economic levers of our society want us to feel this need. They create it within us. They drive our self-identification with more and bigger and shinier so that we will buy just as much as we can and sometimes, often, more than we can. So that when we compare ourselves with our neighbors or coworkers or even our family members, we can feel like we're winning. Right? That's consumerism. That's the problem that we're talking about today. And there's a story in the Bible that I believe says a lot about how and why we compare ourselves to others, but it takes a while to get there, so I'm going to just ask you to buckle up and ride along with me as we head into this story from the book of John, chapter 21. And in this story, Jesus has risen from the dead. This is post-Easter, and he's hanging out with the disciples, and they just had some fish for breakfast. And now he's walking with his disciples, and he turns to Peter, and he says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Real quick thing, the names Simon and Peter are interchangeable. Simon is his birth name, and Peter is the name that Jesus gave to him and refers to him as sometimes, but now he's calling him Simon. Anyway, just so you catch that. If you're confused who's Simon and who's Peter, same guy. All right. So Peter's response is, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." And Jesus responds to him, "Feed my lambs." And a few moments pass, and it's as if Jesus missed the conversation they just had. And Jesus turns to him again and says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And Peter replies again, "Yes, Lord, you know that I love you." Peter's probably a little confused at this point. We just had this conversation. Maybe the memory starts to go after you've been dead for 3 days. I don't know. And again, Jesus says to Peter, "Take care of my sheep." And then for a third time, Jesus turns to Peter and he says, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" And by now, Peter is more than a little concerned. He says to Jesus, "Lord, you know all things. You know that I love you." And once again, for a third, final time, Jesus looks back at Peter and says, "Feed my sheep." All right. So lots of sermons have been given on this particular passage. It's kind of mysterious. People take lots of different angles on it. It's hard to know exactly what is going on. Some folks make a big deal out of the 3 I love yous from Peter, because you see, we're in the book of John, which went into great detail about the 3 times that Peter denied Jesus. So it's almost like Jesus is giving Peter a chance to make up for the 3 denials by giving him a chance to make 3 confessions of his love. So that's one angle on it. Some other folks will get all scholarly and get hung up on the Greek vocabulary going on here. I won't get hung up on it, but I'm going to talk about it, I guess. You see, in ancient Greek, there's actually a few different words for love. And every time Peter says, "I love you," he says, "I philia love you." So philia is a brotherly friendship kind of love. It's a dispassionate love, if that makes any sense at all, because it's more about commitment than it is about emotion, all right? It's a commitment between equals. It's where we get the word Philadelphia, city of brotherly love, because it has philia in there, that kind of love. So Peter says, "I philia love you," but Jesus isn't asking Peter if he philia loves him. Jesus says, "Do you agape love me?" And agape is a different Greek word that also means love, but it's a deeper kind of love. Some have called it unconditional love, but I think a better way of thinking about this word agape is that it is sacrificial love. So what would you sacrifice for? What would you die for? That thing, that person. That's what you're showing agape love to. And so the first time Jesus says, "Peter, do you agape me?" And Peter says, "Jesus, you know I philia you." And so Jesus asks him again, "Peter, do you agape me?" And Peter says, "Oh, yeah, Jesus, I philia you." And then one third time, Jesus gets the hint. The third time, he realizes Peter isn't ready to go there. So Jesus says, "Peter, do you philia me?" Jesus comes down and meets Peter with the kind of love that Peter's willing to offer to Jesus. And Peter's like, "Oh, of course I philia you." And so from this story, we learn that Jesus is looking for sacrificial love. Because, obviously, that's the kind of love that Jesus is offering to us. And we're often only willing to give our affinity or our affection in these limited ways. And so Jesus finally meets us where we're at, because we don't really get it. Just like Peter, we're looking for a relationship with Jesus that is primarily about making me feel good, right? Jesus is asking for a relationship in which we are ready and willing to make sacrifices for the sake of our love for God and neighbor. That's what Jesus is looking for. But if all we're willing to offer to Jesus is a firm handshake of philia love instead of the warm embrace of agape love, Jesus will meet us there too. But the story actually goes on from there. Jesus has this strange little nugget for Peter. Here's what Jesus says after this little back and forth. Jesus says, "Very truly I tell you, when you were younger, you dressed yourself and went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and someone else will dress you and lead you where you do not want to go." Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Then he said to him, "Follow me." So this is officially one of Jesus' most awkward conversations at this point. Jesus called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. He goes on trial and he's like, "What is truth?" when this guy is like sentencing him to death. But this conversation with one of his best friends just might take the cake. Someday, someone else is going to dress you and lead you where you do not want to go. All right, see you later, Peter. That's just like super random. Super random, it feels. Tradition teaches that Peter died for his faith, that he was imprisoned by Roman authorities, put on trial, and executed, just like Jesus. And so Peter was dressed in prison rags and led to a cross. So when Jesus says, "Someone else will dress you and take you where you don't want to go," like that is literally going to play out in the life of Peter. And so when Peter confesses his philia love for Jesus, Jesus responds with, "Good for you. FYI, your life is going to be rough. Buckle up." That's kind of like the Cliff Notes version of what Jesus just said. And so Jesus is not content with Peter's confession of this downgraded philia love. Jesus essentially says to Peter, "Your words suggest one thing about your love, but your actions will say much more." Your words will say one thing about your love, but your actions say much more. And isn't that always the case? Let me just give you a quick hypothetical, for instance, all right? Try to imagine someone who shows up to church week after week to sing about loving God, to preach about loving God, to hear words about love echo in his ears, only just to let them disappear like a vapor as he walks out the church doors. Just try and imagine that, all right? I know that's me on some weeks, so don't worry about it if that feels like you. Now imagine that there's someone else out there who has never set foot in a church, who has distanced herself from everything religious, and yet she cares for her neighbors and for the left outs in society in ways that put most Christians to shame. So I'm going to ask you, which one of these people is loving God better? Ooh. that's yeah, right? That's an uncomfortable question. Which one is showing philia love? And which one is showing agape love? Which one is dispassionate allegiance? And which one is making sacrifice? Zoinks. Of course, the sad fact is this situation isn't hypothetical at all. It happens every day, all over. As Christians, we've gotten so hung up on getting people to say the right words about what they believe, we've forgotten to do the right thing that backs up that belief. We get so caught up in talking about how God loves the world, we forgot that we're supposed to love the world too. And it's this kind of twisted logic that leads to all kinds of hypocrisy that drives people away from faith, that can lead to those people in places of authority to abuse their power, that can leave people scarred and broken by the very movement that is supposed to be healing this world. So enough about that. Let's get back to our story. So put yourself in Peter's shoes for a second here. Jesus just gave you this ominous insight into your own future. How do you respond? Right? What do you say next? And so Peter does what many of us would do in this situation. And here I'm coming back full circle. He looks around and he notices John walking behind them down the road, and he says, "Well, what about him, Jesus?" Jesus says, "Peter, you're going to die like this." And Peter says, "Well, what about him?" Peter's feeling vulnerable, right? Peter is insecure and nervous. And so what's his response? Comparison. We compare ourselves to others whenever we feel out of sorts, as a way of puffing our ego back up. And Peter is no different. Peter looks at another of Jesus' disciples, John, and says, "What about him?" And I love Jesus' answer here. Jesus says, "If I want him to remain alive until I return, what's that to you? You must follow me." What's that to you? You must follow me. So here we are with the disciples, setting the story again. Jesus' inner circle, right? The ones who knew Jesus best, and walking right beside him, the resurrected Jesus. They're walking down the road with the resurrected Jesus, and they are just as caught up in comparison and competition as we are. And Jesus' response to us is the same as it was to them. What is that to you? You must follow me. These are actually the last words of Jesus in the book of John. This is the point that John wanted to leave us with. I think that's pretty interesting. This is the note that this story of Jesus' life leaves us on. What is it to you? You must follow me. And I need to take a moment to tell all of you, just real quick, how much I love this church. I actually met with my boss at the denomination earlier this week. It's an annual conversation that all the pastors have to have. And usually at this conversation, the boss in the denomination will say, "So, is it time to start thinking about what a different church might look like?" But my boss of the denomination knows she doesn't need to ask that question ever because I love this church. I've never experienced a community of faith with so little conflict, and when we have conflict, we do it in healthy ways. I've never experienced a church with so many people so willing to take holy risks, with people who will serve without acting like martyrs. So, just so you know, I love you all deeply. And even with all of that, when I drive to our little church, I have to go by these other joints. Maybe you've seen them. With big parking lots and big facilities and big bottom lines, right? And I think to myself, what could our church do with all those resources, with all that influence in the community? And each time my brain goes down that path of comparison, a voice rises up in me and says, "What is it to you? Follow me." And my heart wants comfort and stability. Maybe yours does too. But my faith asks for more than that. My faith asks for something better than comfort and stability. I wish that philia love was good enough. But it's agape that God is after. Sacrifice. Loving so much you'll give. You see, here's what I want to leave you with. If you don't catch anything else today, here it is. Our urge to compare is at odds with our call to sacrifice. Our urge to compare is at odds with our call to sacrifice. That's the heart behind the words we heard a little bit ago from the book of Romans, where it says, "Don't think of yourselves more highly than you ought." And then a little bit later it says, be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. These two thoughts are intimately connected. I can't both sacrifice for my neighbor and compare myself to him. I can't do both. I can't. If I want what he has, how can I give of my life for his sake? It doesn't work. I mean, unless you're being passive aggressive, and then it works really good. But don't. It's not a recommendation. Just don't. Anyway. But what does that look like in our lives to break ourselves of the cycle of comparison so that we can live out the kind of love God made us to show to this world? What would that look like in your life? It can show up in a lot of ways, and none of them are easy. Are you having a fight over a property line? Let your neighbor win. Are you jockeying for a position at work? Take your hand off the throttle for a minute. Do you have a ritual of sifting through the ads in the Sunday paper to find that next new holy grail purchase you didn't know you needed? Knock it off, all right? Because here's the amazing truth. It's when we let go of those things that we think are giving us life that we find eternal life hidden beneath. It's when we give up on satisfying ourselves that we find real satisfaction. And what does it look like for us to choose sacrifice over comparison as a church? Let's zoom out a little bit. Like, okay, so we've got the individual thing, choose sacrifice over comparison, but what about as a community here, as the decisions and ways we decide to live together? How do we get off the hamster wheel of consumerism as a community that is committed to serving as we say we are? Right? Like we say, we're all about caring for our neighbors, right? About acting justly and loving mercy and walking humbly with God. That's what we say all the time. So what are the tangible, real-world actions that we can do together to live that out? How do we bridge the gap from being a Philia church to being an agape church? We've done that in a few different ways. Our Servant Sundays are a great example. We take any month with 5 Sundays, we take that 5th Sunday, and we don't do a worship service. We worship through service. We do a service project, usually here on site. Sometimes we have to drive around our community to help out different places. So we've got another one coming up in September, and I'm excited for that, and I hope you join us for it. But we don't exactly know what the future holds for Northern Light. But we know what it looks like. We don't know what the future holds, but we know where we're going. We will always refuse to get caught up in the next church growth scheme, the next marketing ploy, the next slick trick just to get people or their pennies. That's never going to be the game we're playing here. We can look over our shoulders all we want, but the voice of Jesus will always bubble up within us and say, what is it to you? You must follow me. One last word I want to say on comparison, and that is this: that the love of God is deep and wide. Deep enough and wide enough for all of us, not just in this room or in this town, but all across this world. And it is incomparable to anything else. I know the word is incomparable, but we're talking about comparison, right? You can't compare that love of God to anything else. And so when we start comparing ourselves to one another as if there was some other way of measuring human worth apart from the mere fact that you are created in the image of a loving God, we're missing the point entirely. We want to live out ways to announce to this world their divine worth for each and every person, and to offer an invitation to live out a life that reflects that divine worth, where truth and beauty and goodness are our native language, where hope and warm embrace, welcome, and inclusion are the everyday rhythm of our lives. And when we can do that in real ways as a church, as individuals, we not only feel that love of God, we're able to show it. And everything comes together. We can stop looking over our shoulders and just follow Jesus. Pray with me. God, we thank you so much that your love is greater than all the ways we try and push it away. We are stubborn. We are focused on the things we can see with our own eyes. We get trapped inside our own heads and forget that there is a universe beyond us that you created out of love for the purpose of love. And we ask today that you would help us to take our eyes off our neighbor over our shoulder in comparison, and may we put our arms around our neighbor instead. Help us to live lives that reflect the great love you show to us, the love that holds this world together and sends us into a beautiful future. Amen.